The wind rolled across the open plains like a restless spirit, carrying dust, the faint scent of sagebrush, and the low hum of distant thunder. The evening sun hung low, casting a warm amber glow across the land, where silence spoke louder than words. Along an old dirt trail that cut through miles of wilderness, a lone rider stopped beside a broken-down wagon. His horse, weary from the long ride, pawed the ground, sensing something uneasy in the air. The man dismounted slowly, his boots crunching the dry earth beneath him as his eyes scanned the scene before him. The wagon leaned to one side, its wheels half buried in the soft soil. The air was still, but a faint cry broke through it, a cry not of fear but of pain. He followed the sound, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver, until he saw her, a young woman lying against the broken wagon wheel, her dress torn and stained with the dust of the road. Her face was pale, her breaths shallow, yet even through her exhaustion there was a fire in her eyes, a determination that clung to her as tightly as life itself. "Please," she whispered as he approached, her voice trembling but strong enough to carry meaning. "Don't come closer, unless you mean no harm." He stopped a few feet away, lowering his weapon and tipping his hat with quiet respect. "Ma'am, I don't mean trouble. Just heard you callin'. Looks like you need help." Her hand went to her belly, round and heavy with the weight of new life. The sight froze him in place. He had seen many things on the trail, men dying for gold, outlaws chasing shadows, and towns swallowed by silence, but this was different. There was something sacred in that moment, fragile yet unbreakable. "They came at dawn," she said softly, "took everything we had. My husband tried to stop them, that. They shot him down. I ran," her voice broke, and she bit her lip to stop the tears. "I thought I was far enough, but they'll come again. They'll always do." He could see the fear in her eyes, the kind that settled deep into the soul. "Who were they?" he asked. She shook her head. "Men without hearts, raiders from the East Ridge. They burn what they can't steal." Her breath quickened. "That doesn't matter now. I just need one thing from you." He knelt beside her, his heart pounding as thunder grumbled across the horizon. "Name it." Her hand trembled as she reached for his sleeve, clutching it like a lifeline. "Please, protect my son," she whispered. "Swear to me you'll keep him safe, no matter what happens." For a long moment, he said nothing. The weight of her plea hung between them, heavier than the storm rolling in. His life had been one of drifting from one town to another, from one job to the next, a man without roots, without family. He had sworn loyalty before, 2 men who had betrayed him, 2 causes that had led to bloodshed. But this was different. He saw something in her eyes, a kind of faith that only the desperate carried. Slowly, he took off his hat and bowed his head. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice rough but steady, "you have my word. I'll protect your boy. I swear it." She let out a breath, as though releasing all the pain she had been holding. Her body relaxed, her hand still gripping his sleeve. Then, with a faint smile that seemed to come from a place far beyond pain, she whispered, "Thank you." The man looked around. The land stretched endlessly, no sign of shelter or safety. The storm clouds gathered, dark and heavy, promising rain before nightfall. He knew time was short. He gathered his strength, looked back at her and said, "What's your name, ma'am?" But she didn't answer. Her eyes had already closed. A stillness settled over her face, peaceful, eternal. The cry of the wind grew louder, and for a long while he just knelt there beside her, hat pressed against his chest, the weight of his promise sinking into his heart. When he finally looked down, he noticed a small bundle beside her, a blanket wrapped tightly, faint movement stirring within. He carefully unwrapped it and found a newborn child, his tiny hand reaching out as if searching for the mother who could no longer answer. The man stared at the boy, feeling something deep within him shift, a sense of purpose he hadn't known he still possessed. He stood, cradling the child against his chest, and looked toward the dark line of the forest ahead. The raiders could still be near. The woman's words echoed in his mind, "Protect my son." It wasn't just a plea anymore. It was a vow. He carried the baby to his horse and mounted, adjusting the blanket so the cold wind wouldn't reach the child's face. The first drops of rain began to fall, gentle at first, then heavier. The man guided his horse forward, leaving behind the broken wagon and the woman who had placed her last hope in him. He didn't know where the trail would lead, but he knew one thing: he could not let her down. As they rode into the gathering storm, lightning split the sky, revealing the rugged hills in the distance. For a brief moment, he thought he saw movement, shadows against the horizon, riders coming fast. His grip tightened on the reins. The child stirred and whimpered, and the man whispered softly, "It's all right, boy. I've got you now." He veered off the main trail, steering toward the canyon where he could find cover. The sound of hooves behind him grew faint, then louder again, echoing off the cliffs. Whoever those men were, they weren't finished yet. The storm's roar mixed with the pounding of his heart as he urged his horse faster. By the time he reached the canyon's edge, the rain was pouring in sheets. He found a shallow cave and guided the horse inside, holding the baby close as he listened to the thunder fade into a steady rhythm. For a while he thought they might have escaped. But when he glanced out toward the trail, he saw faint torches flickering in the distance, men searching, hunting. He knew they would find the wagon soon. They would see what had happened, and then they would come for him. The baby began to cry again, a soft, helpless sound that seemed to echo through the cave. The man rocked him gently, whispering, "Hush now, little one. We'll be all right." Yet even as he said it, he wasn't sure if he believed it. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of voices growing closer. He checked his revolver, 5 bullets left. Not much, but enough if he made every shot count. He looked down at the child, at the tiny face half hidden beneath the blanket, and something inside him hardened. He had made a promise, and come what may, he would keep it. The firelight flickered against the canyon walls, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts of the past. Somewhere out there, men were moving through the darkness, the same ones who had taken everything from the woman he had just buried. Now they were coming for the last thing she had left behind. Took a deep breath, stepped out into the rain, and watched the storm light up the valley below. His voice was low, almost lost in the wind, but his words carried weight. "You'll have to go through me first." The thunder rolled again, closer this time, and the horse snorted, uneasy. The baby's cries had quieted, as if sensing the calm before the storm. The man stood there, a lone figure against the vast wilderness, holding a promise that bound him too. Something greater than himself. And as lightning split the sky once more, revealing the approaching riders through sheets of rain, the night seemed to hold its breath, knew that before the dawn came, the land would remember the sound of gunfire, and a promise would either be kept or broken. The rain slowed by dawn, leaving the land washed clean but heavy with silence. The man sat near the cave's mouth, the baby resting beside him in a worn saddle blanket. The child slept soundly now, unaware of the danger that had circled them through the night. The man's eyes were fixed on the horizon where the storm clouds still drifted away, glowing faintly in the first light of morning. He hadn't slept, not for a second. His revolver lay across his knee, the barrel cold from the night air. He had counted 6 riders the evening before, shadows against the lightning, following the wagon trail. They hadn't come close enough to see the cave, but he knew they would return. Men like that didn't stop until they had what they came for. He could still hear the woman's voice in his head, soft but unshakable. "Protect my son." That single plea had changed everything. He was no longer just a drifter moving from one trail to another. Now he carried a promise, and that promise had a heartbeat. He looked down at the baby again. The boy's tiny fingers curled around a fold of the blanket, his breathing steady. He didn't even have a name. The man realized that in all her desperation, the woman hadn't told him what to call her child. That thought lingered with him, how someone could give everything for another life and still leave behind so many unanswered questions. When the light grew stronger, he packed his saddlebag, filled his canteen from a small puddle near the rocks, and secured the boy against his chest with a strip of cloth torn from his poncho. Then he mounted his horse and steered away from the canyon, keeping to the lower ridges where the morning fog still hung thick. He didn't ride toward any town. Towns meant people, and people asked questions. For now, he needed time to think about who those raiders were, what they had been after, and how far they would go to find the child. He had seen their kind before, desperate men who lived by the gun and burned whatever stood in their way. But something told him this wasn't just another gang looking for loot. There had been purpose in their hunt, something more than greed. By midday, he reached the edge of a dry valley. The earth was cracked, the air still heavy from the storm. He stopped near an old windmill that creaked with every breath of wind. A broken fence ran beside it, leading to what looked like the remains of a homestead long abandoned. The roof had caved in, the door hung by a single hinge, and wild grass had taken over what used to be a small corral. It wasn't much, but it would do for shelter. He dismounted and carried the child inside. Dust rose as he laid the boy on a bundle of hay and struck a match to light a small fire. The warmth filled the dim space, pushing back the chill that clung to the morning. For the first time since the storm, he let out a deep breath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small locket he'd taken from the woman's hand before burying her. He turned the locket over in his fingers, wondering where the house in that sketch might be. Maybe the raiders had destroyed it, maybe it still stood somewhere beyond the hills, waiting for someone who would never return. He couldn't know, but something in his gut told him that whatever happened to her family wasn't by chance. When the baby stirred, he leaned over, speaking softly. "You've got your mother's courage, I'll give you that." The boy blinked up at him with wide, curious eyes. He couldn't help but smile. "Guess I'll have to call you something, huh?" He paused, thinking for a moment, then said quietly, "How about Clay? Seems to fit." Strong name? The baby didn't answer, of course, but the man felt better having said it out loud. As the day went on, he tended to the horse and gathered what little food he had left. A piece of dried meat, half a loaf of bread, and a handful of coffee beans he kept in a tin. He'd been living on less before. He could manage. What worried him more was the direction they should go next. But going there meant exposure. If the raiders were tracking him, they'd check every outpost in town along the trails. Still, staying in one place wasn't safe either. He decided they'd leave by nightfall. The hours passed slowly, filled with the quiet sounds of wind and the crackle of fire. Every so often, he stepped outside to check the horizon. Once he spotted dust rising far off in the east, faint but steady. Could have been riders, could have been the wind. He couldn't be sure, but his gut told him they weren't alone. As the sun dipped low, he saddled the horse again and wrapped Clay securely in his blanket. The boy had fallen asleep, his small hand gripping the man's coat as if by instinct, mounted and turned westward, moving through the valley in the fading light. Night fell quickly. Then he saw a flicker of firelight far ahead, maybe a mile or two off. He stopped, narrowing his eyes. The glow came from behind a rise in the land. It could be travelers, or it could be the men he'd been trying to avoid. He couldn't take chances. He turned his horse toward a narrow pass that wound through a cluster of rocks and trees, hoping to circle around unseen. As he moved, the horse suddenly snorted, ears flicking back. "Ah!" The man froze. The faint sound of hoofbeats reached his ears, not from ahead but behind. He turned slowly and saw movement on the ridge, dark shapes against the moonlight. He counted for this time, maybe 5. They were closing in. He urged the horse forward, keeping low in the saddle. The boy began to cry softly, and he whispered, "Hush now, Clay, just hold on." The riders behind him spread out, their silhouettes breaking into separate lines as they tried to cut him off. He knew this land enough to find a way through. A riverbed lay not far from here, dry for most of the year, its twists and turns perfect for losing a trail. He found it just as the first bullet whined past his shoulder and cracked against a rock. He didn't look back. He drove the horse down the bank, dust rising around them, and kept riding. The sound of pursuit grew louder, the thud of hooves echoing through the canyon walls. His heart pounded as he urged the horse faster. He leaned low, guiding the horse through the winding path, until finally the echoes began to fade. The only sound now was the whisper of the wind. He waited there in the dark, breath shallow, hand on his revolver. After a long while, he realized the riders had gone another way. When he finally moved again, the night had grown colder. His coat was soaked through, and the child slept restlessly against his chest. It wasn't safety, but it was a place to rest, a place to ask questions. He stopped on a hill overlooking the town and took one last look behind him. The land was quiet, no sign of pursuit, but he knew better than to trust the silence. They'll find more than they bargained for. The man wondered what kind of world this child had been born into, a place of guns, greed, and broken promises. Yet even in that thought there was something else, a spark of hope. He nudged the horse forward, heading down toward the waking town. Behind him, far across the valley, A single rider appeared on the horizon, watching. The morning sun caught the metal of his rifle, flashing like a warning. The man didn't see it, not yet. But soon, the past he carried and the promise he made would catch up with him once more. The town of Red Hollow sat quiet in the morning sun, a small patch of life surrounded by miles of open land. Wooden buildings leaned into the wind as if tired from standing too long. Few townsfolk moved about, a man sweeping dust from his porch, a woman hanging laundry behind the saloon, and a pair of children chasing a stray dog down the street. The man rode in slow, keeping his hat low, the baby swaddled tight against his chest. He looked like any other traveler passing through, but his eyes never stopped scanning the corners, the rooftops, the shadows. He tied his horse outside a modest inn near the edge of town. A weathered sign swung overhead, reading Sutter's Rest. The place looked decent enough, not clean but not rotten either. Inside, the smell of coffee and wood smoke drifted through the air. A woman behind the counter looked up when he entered, her gaze pausing on the bundle in his arms. "Need a room?" she asked, her voice soft but wary. "For a few nights," he replied. "It's just me and the boy." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You'll want one upstairs, less noise from the street." He paid her with the few coins he had left and carried the child up the narrow staircase. The room was small, one bed, a cracked mirror, and a single window that looked out toward the hills. He laid the baby down and stood for a long while, staring out into the distance. Somewhere out there, men were riding, still searching. After settling the boy, he went downstairs again. The woman at the counter was pouring coffee into tin cups for a pair of ranch hands. "You look like you've been on the trail a while," she said. "Too long," he replied, taking the cup. "Been heading west. Trouble behind me." Her brow arched slightly. "This part of the country's had plenty of that lately. You'll find no law worth a dime out here. Sheriff does what he can, but folks mostly take care of their own." He nodded, sipping the bitter coffee. "What kind of trouble?" She leaned in, lowering her voice. "Raiders mostly. Some say they ain't just outlaws, that someone's paying them." That caught his attention. He thought of the woman on the trail, the fire in her eyes as she begged him to save her son. "You ever hear of a woman traveling east of here? Might have been with her husband, expecting a child." The woman frowned, thinking, "Can't say I have. But a wagon came through 2 weeks back, headed that way. Word was, they never made it to the next town. Folks figured the ridgemen got to them." She hesitated, watching him closely. "You knew them?" He didn't answer right away. "Just crossed paths," he said finally. "Didn't end well." The woman gave a quiet nod, understanding more than he said. "If you're looking for work, there's a ranch a few miles out, Hollow Creek. Owner's an old soldier, runs the place with a couple of hands. Always needs help." He thanked her, finished his coffee, and went back upstairs. The baby was awake now, looking up at the ceiling as light filtered through the cracked glass. Green and gold beneath the sun, with cattle grazing along a shallow stream. The ranch house stood solid, built from stone and timber. A man stood on the porch, tall, gray-haired, with a rifle resting against his shoulder. "Something I can do for you?" the rancher called out as he rode up. "Looking for work?" he said, dismounting. "Name's Harlan." The rancher's eyes moved to the baby strapped against his chest. "That your boy?" Harlan hesitated. "Not by blood. Just my responsibility now." The older man studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You look like you can handle yourself. We can always use another set of hands." "I'm Amos Reed." Harlan worked through the next days fixing fences, hauling feed, and helping with the livestock. It felt strange to stay in one place, but the quiet work kept his mind steady. He built a small crib in the barn's corner for Clay, who seemed to grow stronger by the day. At night, when the air cooled and the crickets sang, Harlan would sit outside, staring toward the horizon where the ridge lay hidden under moonlight. He knew the peace wouldn't last. On the fourth evening, Amos joined him on the porch. "You've got the look of a man waiting on something," he said. "Not waiting," Harlan replied. "Watching," Amos chuckled softly. "That's what I used to tell myself, back when I was running with the army. You learn quick that trouble don't care whether you're ready or not, just comes." He took a long drag from his pipe. "I've seen men like you before, carrying ghosts." "You want to tell me who's after you?" Harlan hesitated, then said, "A gang out of the ridge? They killed the boy's mother. I gave her my word I'd keep him safe. Amos was silent for a moment. Then you'd best keep your gun clean. Those men have been coming closer every week. Folks whisper that they're after something, not money, not land. Something worth dying for. The words sat heavy between them. Harlan thought again of the woman's locket, the sketch of the man in uniform. Maybe the truth lay somewhere in that drawing. Maybe her husband had left something behind, something those men wanted. The next morning, as Harlan headed into town for supplies, he stopped at the blacksmith's shop to repair his saddle. The smith, a quiet man named Eli, was working at the forge, sweat running down his face. When Harlan mentioned the Ridge Gang, Eli glanced around and lowered his hammer. "You best not talk about them out loud," he warned. "They've got eyes everywhere." "Last man who asked too many questions ended up face down in the river. Who leads them?" Harlan asked. Eli wiped his brow. "Name's Deacon. Used to ride with the army before turning bad. Some say he's got a score to settle with a man who betrayed him, a soldier who stole something valuable years back." The word struck Harlan like a spark in dry grass. He thought of the uniformed man in the locket, the half-faded sketch. Maybe that was it, the reason the gang had hunted the woman and her family. When he returned to the ranch, Amos was waiting by the barn, his face grave. "We had visitors while you were gone," he said. "It's 2 riders asking questions. Said they were bounty men looking for a woman and her child." Harlan felt the air tighten in his chest. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing they didn't already know, but they'll be back." They had that look, men who don't give up easy. That night, Harlan didn't sleep. Sat near Clay's crib, listening to the wind scrape against the barn walls. Every creak made his hand twitch toward his revolver. In the darkness, he made a silent promise to the boy once more. No one would touch him. Not while he still breathed. A few days later, word spread through Red Hollow that the raiders had been seen near the South Pass. A wagon train heading east had been ambushed. No survivors found. Panic started to ripple through the town. Folks boarded windows, gathered supplies, and talked about leaving before the next full moon. Harlan watched it all from the edge of the street. Fear had a way of changing people. Saw it in their eyes, the same fear the woman had carried when she begged him to protect her son. That evening, as the sky turned red with sunset, a figure rode into town. The man wore a long coat and carried a rifle slung across his back. His face was rough, scarred, but his posture calm. The townsfolk stared as he tied his horse outside the saloon and walked in. Harlan felt his stomach twist when he saw the tattoo on the man's hand, a mark shaped like a burning ridge. The same mark the raiders carried. He followed quietly, pushing open the saloon door just enough to hear. The stranger ordered a drink, then said to the barkeep, "Looking for a drifter traveling with a baby. I'd have come through here after the storm." The room went silent. Harlan stepped back into the shadowed street, his mind racing. The hunt had reached Red Hollow. He knew then there was no outrunning this anymore. The raiders weren't just chasing revenge or gold. They were chasing something buried deep in the past. Something connected to the boy's bloodline. As night fell over the town, Harlan packed his things at the ranch. He moved quietly, careful not to wake Amos. The baby stirred but didn't cry as he wrapped him in a blanket. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the faint scent of rain. He saddled his horse and looked back once at the light burning in the ranch house window. He hated leaving Amos behind, but staying would only bring danger to his door. He mounted and turned toward the dark hills. Behind him, the town lights faded into the distance, swallowed by the endless night. Ahead, the land stretched wide and wild, filled with questions and danger. Somewhere out there, the truth waited about the woman, the raiders, and the promise that bound him to the child in his arms. But as he rode into the darkness, a flicker of fire appeared on the ridge behind him, then another. Torches. The hunt was not over. It had only just begun. The night swallowed the trail as Harlan rode hard through the hills, the sound of hoofbeats echoing behind him like a shadow that refused to die. The baby stirred against his chest, whimpering softly as the cold air cut through the silence. Harlan pulled his coat tighter around them both, his eyes fixed on the winding path ahead. The land stretched endlessly, rough, wild, and alive with danger. Behind him, the flicker of torches burned along the ridge, scattered but closing in. He'd been running since sunset, pushing both himself and his horse past their limits. Each time he thought he'd lost them, the faint sound of pursuit returned, steady and deliberate. They weren't chasing blindly, they were tracking him, and whoever led them knew how to hunt. The moon hung low, pale and cold against the night sky. Harlan slowed his horse near a patch of cottonwoods that grew beside a narrow creek. The water shimmered faintly, and he could hear the frogs croaking nearby. He dismounted quietly, checked the baby, and set him down on a patch of soft grass. Clay slept through the motion, his small hands curling tightly around the edge of his blanket. Harlan crouched by the water, letting the horse drink as he filled his canteen. His reflection looked back at him, tired eyes, dirt on his face, and a weight in his stare that came from too many losses. He had lived a long time running from the past, but now the past was chasing him, wearing a different face and carrying torches through the night. He listened again. No wind now, only the slow trickle of the stream. Then he heard it, faint, like a whisper, the sound of metal clicking.
Odd froze.
The shot came a moment later, tearing through the quiet and splintering the trunk of a nearby tree. He dropped to the ground, pulling his revolver from his belt, and crawled toward the baby. Another shot followed, closer this time. He rolled behind a fallen log and fired back once, aiming toward the flash of light on the ridge. The cry of a horse answered, then silence. Harlan didn't wait, grabbed Clay, mounted again, and rode along the creek, staying low beneath the trees. The baby began to cry, the sound sharp and frightened. He whispered, "It's all right, boy. We'll make it through this." But he wasn't sure he believed his own words. After an hour, he came across an old cabin tucked into a hollow at the base of the hills. The roof was half collapsed, and the door hung open, but it offered shelter. He guided the horse inside a small corral out back and carried Clay into the cabin. Inside, the air smelled of rot and smoke, but it was dry. He laid the baby down on a tattered blanket and checked his revolver. 2 bullets left. He found an old lantern, lit it, and set it near the window. The faint light filled the room, casting long, uneasy shadows across the walls. He could hear the distant rumble of thunder again, another storm moving in from the west. He wondered how long it would take for the riders to find this place. For the first time since leaving Red Hollow, he allowed himself to think about what this was really about. The woman, the gang, the locket, it all tied back to something long buried. Deacon's name echoed in his mind. A soldier turned outlaw, a man who wanted revenge, but for what? And why hunt down a woman who had nothing left but her child? He reached into his coat and pulled out the locket again. The picture of the man in uniform looked clearer in the glow of the lantern. The lines of his face were sharp, proud, but there was something familiar in the eyes, something that made Harlan's stomach turn. He'd seen that face before, years ago, when he himself wore a uniform. He remembered a raid on a small outpost near the border, the night sky burning with fire and smoke. A young officer had ordered the attack reckless, brutal, and many innocent people had died. Harlan had followed orders then, like all soldiers did, but the memory never left him. That officer's name had been Colton Reed, Amos Reed's brother. The truth hit him like a blow. The woman's husband must have been Colton, and whatever he'd taken from Deacon during the war had set this whole chain in motion. The raiders weren't just hunting treasure, they were hunting legacy. And now, that legacy was in his arms. The baby whimpered again, pulling him from his thoughts. Harlan knelt beside him, brushing a hand over his head. "Your father left something behind," he said quietly. "Something men are still dying over. I don't know what it is yet, but I'll find out before they get to you." The wind howled outside and rain began to fall in heavy drops. He doused the lantern and peered through the cracked window. The storm would cover their tracks for now, but it also meant Deacon's men would be moving slower. That gave him time, maybe enough to reach the mining ridge by dawn. He'd heard stories that old army supplies had been buried there long ago, forgotten after the war.
Maybe.
That was what Deacon was after. He gathered what little he had, wrapped the baby tight, and stepped into the storm. The wind tore at his coat and the rain stung his face, but he pushed on. The horse followed close, its hooves sinking into the mud. The flashes of lightning lit up the trail ahead, revealing twisted trees and the faint outline of distant cliffs. For hours, he rode through the downpour, every muscle aching, every sense on edge. Each flash of light made him expect to see the riders behind him, but the hills remained empty. When he finally saw the outline of the ridge in the gray light of dawn, relief washed through him. He'd made it this far. but deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of what was coming. He took shelter beneath an overhang and waited for the rain to ease. The baby slept again, his small breaths barely audible over the storm. Harlan watched the valley below. Through the shifting mist, he could see movement, dark figures winding along the trail. Deacon's men had found his tracks again. He knew he couldn't outrun them forever. The ridge offered only one advantage: height. If he made it to the top, he could see them coming and maybe buy himself enough time to think. He mounted once more, his body trembling from exhaustion, and started the climb. The path was narrow and slick, bordered by jagged rock. The horse struggled, hooves slipping, but Harlan pushed forward. The storm was fading now, leaving behind the kind of silence that comes before something worse. Halfway up, he heard a whistle, sharp and deliberate. Then came another shot. The bullet struck the rock beside him, sending shards flying. He turned and saw them, 3 riders breaking through the mist, rifles raised. He urged the horse upward, heart hammering. Mud splashed around him, the baby crying again from the motion. Another shot came, grazing his arm. He gritted his teeth and kept climbing, ignoring the pain. When he reached the top, he dismounted, ducked behind a boulder, and fired back. 1 rider fell. The others scattered, circling wide to trap him. Rainwater ran down his face as he reloaded, his hands shaking. He could hear them shouting below, spreading out. He looked toward the baby, lying wrapped in the saddle blanket behind him, and felt something inside him harden. He wouldn't let them have him. Not now, not ever. He pulled the locket from his pocket again, staring at it for a long moment before slipping it into the baby's blanket. "If I don't make it through this," he whispered, "that'll tell you who you are." Thunder rolled again, deep and low. Harlan took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the rock. The ridge opened before him, narrow and steep, with nowhere left to run. The riders were closing in, their torches burning through the mist. He counted at least 6 now, maybe more. He fired twice, hitting one. The others returned fire, bullets cracking through the air. The horse reared, panicked, and the baby let out a sharp cry. The sound pierced the chaos like a blade. For a brief second, everything slowed. The wind, the rain, even the gunfire, and Harlan saw Deacon himself emerging through the mist. He was taller than the others, his coat dark and heavy, his face half hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His voice carried across the ridge, deep and steady. "You've run a long way, soldier," he called out. "But it ends here. That boy belongs to me." Harlan's jaw tightened. He belongs to no one. Deacon stepped closer, his boots crunching against the wet stone. "You don't even know what you're carrying. That child's bloodline holds what your government took from me. Give him to me, and you'll walk away breathing." The storm rumbled again, lightning splitting the sky above them. Harlan raised his revolver, his voice low and certain. "I made a promise." The wind howled, carrying the smell of rain and gunpowder. Deacon lifted his rifle. The 2 men stood facing each other at the edge of the world, one bound by vengeance, the other by a dying woman's plea. The storm's roar filled the silence as both prepared to draw. Then came the crack of thunder, the flash of steel, and the world exploded into motion. The shot echoed across the ridge, swallowed by thunder and rain. Harlan staggered, the impact throwing him back against the rocks. His revolver slipped from his grasp and clattered to the ground. Pain burned through his shoulder, but he refused to fall. Through the haze of smoke and rain, he saw Deacon standing still, his rifle raised, his eyes locked on him. The man's face was hard, worn from years of bitterness, but beneath that hatred, there was something else, a hollow sadness that came from losing too much for too long. Harlan drew a slow breath and steadied himself, his boots slipping slightly on the wet stone. He knew he didn't have many chances left, but he wasn't ready to quit. Behind him, the baby began to cry again, the sound small but piercing through the storm. It made Deacon hesitate for just a second, his gaze flicking toward the bundle lying near the saddle. That second was all Harlan needed. He dove for the revolver, rolled, and fired. Deacon stumbled back, dropping his rifle. The man fell to his knees, clutching his chest, eyes wide with disbelief. The rain fell harder now, washing the dust and blood into the cracks of the ridge. Harlan stayed crouched, breathing hard, waiting to see if Deacon would move again. But the outlaw only looked up at him, his lips curling into a faint, almost peaceful smile. "You don't even know," he rasped, his voice barely audible through the storm. "That boy, he's the last piece of everything they took." Then he fell silent, his body still. The storm raged on, but for Harlan, everything had gone quiet. He stood there for a long time, staring at the man who had chased him across half the desert, wondering what truth those final words carried. When the thunder finally began to fade, he turned and went to the baby. Clay was crying harder now, his tiny hands reaching up toward him. Harlan lifted him gently, cradling him close, and whispered, "It's over, little one. You're safe now." But even as he said it, he knew that safety was a fragile thing. The ridge was littered with broken men, each one chasing ghosts from a past that refused to die. Harlan felt the weight of all that death pressing down on him, the cost of promises and the burden of memory. He found Deacon's rifle and tossed it aside, then gathered what supplies he could and started down the ridge. The rain had begun to ease, leaving behind a heavy fog that clung to the earth like breath. By the time he reached the valley, the first light of dawn was spreading across the sky. The world felt washed clean, quiet, almost sacred. Birds stirred in the trees, and somewhere in the distance the faint sound of a river carried through the air. Harlan stopped beside a fallen tree and sank to his knees, exhaustion finally catching up with him. The baby had drifted back to sleep, his head resting against Harlan's chest. He sat there for a while, staring out over the valley. The land was wide and wild, the kind of place that could bury stories deeper than any grave. He thought about the woman from Red Hollow, about her last words and the promise he had made. She had trusted him to protect her child, and now that promise was all he had left. Whatever secret the baby carried, whatever legacy Deacon had been chasing, it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the boy's chance to live free of the sins that came before him. As the sun climbed higher, Harlan stood and started walking again. He followed the river north, toward the lowlands where he knew a small settlement lay. It would take a day or two to reach it, maybe more, but that didn't bother him. The journey felt different now, not a flight from danger, but a step toward something new. Along the way, he passed the remains of an old army camp. The tattered flag still hung from a pole, faded and torn. He stopped and stared at it for a long time. That banner had once meant everything to him: duty, pride, loyalty. But now it only reminded him of how many lives had been lost under its shadow. He reached up, took the flag down, and folded it neatly before tucking it into his coat. "No more fighting," he murmured. "It's not for me." When he finally reached the edge of the settlement the next evening, the air was calm and warm. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the faint laughter of children drifted through the streets. He led his horse to a small barn on the outskirts and asked the owner for shelter. The farmer, an older man with kind eyes, nodded without hesitation. "You look like you've been through hell," the man said softly. Harlan gave a tired smile. Could say that. The man noticed the baby and raised an eyebrow. "Yours." Harlan hesitated before answering. "Is now." The farmer simply nodded, as if he understood, and offered him a place to rest. That night, Harlan lay by the fire, watching the flames flicker across the walls. Clay slept beside him, the faintest smile on his face. Joe. For the first time in a long while, Harlan allowed himself to feel something like peace. In the days that followed, he worked quietly on the farm, helping mend fences, chop wood, and tend the horses. The farmer's wife took to caring for the baby, and Clay began to grow stronger. Sometimes Harlan caught himself watching the boy and thinking about the life he would one day lead. A life far from the violence that had shaped both of their paths. One evening, the farmer handed him a letter that had come through a trader passing by. It was old and weathered, addressed to Marshal Harlan Tate, in handwriting he recognized instantly. He opened it slowly, and inside was a single page. The message was short. "If you're reading this, it means you kept your word. His name is Clay Reed. His father was my husband, Colton. What they were all looking for isn't gold or land, it's truth. Tell him one day that his family stood for something worth dying for." There was no signature, but he didn't need one. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into his coat. For a long time, he sat in silence, feeling the weight of everything that had brought him here. Then he looked toward the horizon, where the last light of sunset painted the sky in shades of red and gold. The next morning, Harlan saddled his horse. The farmer asked if he was leaving, and Harlan nodded. "There's more I need to set right," he said. He handed the man a small pouch of coins. "For the boy. Make sure he's cared for." The farmer frowned. "He'll need you more than money." Harlan gave a faint smile. "He'll have a better chance without my ghosts following him." He rode out at sunrise, the sound of hooves steady against the soft earth. The air smelled of rain and sage, and the world ahead looked endless again. He didn't know where the road would lead, but for the first time, he wasn't running. He was searching, not for redemption, but for peace. As he rode through the open land, he thought about all the people he'd met and lost, about the promises made and kept. He realized that some stories don't end with victory or defeat. They end when a man decides to stop fighting the past and start living for what's still left. By midday, the ridge was far behind him, and the valley spread wide in every direction. He stopped once more, turned his horse toward the wind, and looked back. Somewhere beyond those hills, a boy would grow up not knowing the weight of his family's pain. Maybe that was enough. Harlan adjusted his hat, whispered something too soft for the wind to carry, and rode on. The land stretched ahead, quiet, boundless, and waiting. And though the ghosts would always follow at a distance, they no longer held him. He rode until the horizon blurred with the sky, the sound of his horse fading into the distance like a promise kept. And when the sun dipped low again, the world felt still, not empty, but full of the quiet kind of hope that only comes when a story finally finds its rest.